There, perfect. So, oh, I'm getting little pop-ups. I'll allow that. So I'm a teacher and facilitator here at MICH. I'm Susanna. I also hold a private practice in homeopathy and astrology. I am a self-taught astrologer. I've been studying since I was 16 and working with clients for the last 20 years. But I have to say my practice was deeply influenced by the training that I have had at MICH. And it was really like, I really feel like at its heart, MICH is a mystery school, and we get to not only learn, but like come into the experience of something bigger than us in a way that informs us to also participate in that bigger thing. And it was really that like let me learn how to work with the immaterial dimension of life. And learning how to work with that was what unlocked my ability to understand astrology on a multidimensional level and to work with people in a humanistic, client-centered way. Because I know that, oh, I just realized that you guys are all up in the shared screen. So I'm just going to move that out. Yeah, so I realized how important it was to work on that humanistic level with people, because so often you'll go to an astrologer and you'll be sitting with them, and it's not that it's a disappointing experience, but it's like they are focused on something other than you. And it's always fascinated me, to think of that. And when I was practicing a long time ago, I realized there was something missing. There was a bit of a lost opportunity to connect with the experience of the person sometimes. And so it was really in my training at MICH that let me, I guess, bridge those two ways of working. And so this is an overview of what we're going to look at today. We'll first look at what is astrology, then homeopathy and the MICH method. We'll move on to energetic dimensions of experience, the meaning of the natal chart, until finally we'll come to the significance of the sun and moon and two remedies related to them. And so all of this talk about astrology and homeopathy and the MICH method are really coming into the symbolism of the sun and the moon, and also how we work with them in case taking. And so my goal is to inspire you, and I don't want you to feel like you have to know or understand anything I'm talking about today. If you have an aha moment, great. If not, don't worry. So take what you can and know that as you continue in your studies, what's important for you to know will become clearer. So if I was going to prioritize anything in your learning today, it's to remember that integration is a key component to your training at MICH, and today's talk is a bonus to wherever you're at on your learning journey. So what is astrology when we look at that? It's basically a system of observation and symbols. And it's been developed over millennia as a divinatory language. And this is really important. So as we evolved, astrology evolved along with us, and it led to different branches of practicing and ways of using astrology. So mundane astrology is typically related to observing political events. Electional astrology is used to choose optimal times. Horary is used to answer questions. And today, the big three reasons to consult an astrologer are love, health, and money. And I don't know that that's changed so much. I imagine that this was the case for a long time. We used to use, well, we still do use a lot of books, but typically the tools of an astrologer right now are an ephemeris, book of tables, and then, of course, the software that modern astrologers have collects all that information from them. But it's important to notice or recognize that these tools are condensing and collecting information that originally came from direct observation and experience. And so at its heart, astrology is still a divinatory language, and it's best applied as a tool to dialogue with our soul, and not get caught up in, I don't know, like the cookbook kind of interpretations of the meanings of a planet and a sign or a house. So if we look back at I guess, the origins of astrology, I'm a bit of a romantic, so I feel like I've got the notion that our ancestors were also gazing at the stars, contemplating creation and where we came from. But the evidence that we found, or what we have found, of them tracking lunar phases is that they watch the sky for practical reasons. And if we try to imagine what life was like, I don't know, 27,000 years ago, kind of makes sense. They were intimately connected to their environment, for better or worse. They had no brick houses or central heat. They had no electricity to light the night sky, which on the one hand meant that they were at risk of exposure to sun and heat and limited vision at night, but it also meant that they had a really close relationship with the lights. They had a really close relationship with the sun and when it would rise and when it would set. And they were not separate, like their activities were not separate from those lunar and solar cycles. So it's like the movement on Earth wasn't separate from the movement of the planets, I guess. So this image shows, it's dated to be about 27,000 BC. It's a rock that's found with lunar phase notations. And so it's a really basic observation of celestial phenomena, and like capturing or tracking or collecting those observations. In ancient 6,000 BC in Mesopotamian era, we have evidence of astral diviners. So they would recognize different activities, like say solar eclipses, and make a connection to things that were of importance to them, like war or agriculture. In 2000 BC, we see Egyptian solar calendars. This is actually like a fresco. It's like a ceiling painting or carving, I guess, on the temple of Hathor. And so this is when we started assigning planets as deities. In 550 BC, astrology evolved a little bit more in incorporating the influence of Plato and Pythagoras. And this is what led to the creation of the natal chart that we recognize today. And if we break that down, it's first of all, it's an image that represents the cosmos at a particular moment in time and space, but it also holds true to all of the observations that we had as experiences of the sun rising, reaching its zenith on the descendant, which is setting, and then at the nadir, which is the IC. So when we see the chart, these are the angles of the chart, and they are really based on the movement of the sun and the availability of light, or the different qualities of light that we would experience at those different times. So everything that we're seeing today in the language and in the symbols of astrology came from a direct experience and observation. And so the language is comprised of different symbols. And the most important are planets. They represent a really pure energy and basic movement in the chart. And so everything in the chart, from the symbol of the planet to the zodiac to the houses, are really related and strongly connected to the energy of the planets. So everything else relates to them. And if we were to use the example of actors in a play, that's what they are. So if we were to use an example of the play as a metaphor for the chart, the planets are the actors in the play. And those actors have different relationships to each other. And so we can look at aspects, which is another type of symbol that we're going to see in the chart, and know that they modify planetary energy. So we're looking at the relationship between actors when we're looking at aspects. Signs are best known, so everybody knows their sun sign. And these are modes of expression. So they're similar to what the costumes the actors would wear. And then finally, there's the house system. And this is the place of expression. It's the setting and the scenery for the actors. So in a nutshell, what we're looking at when we look at a chart is it's something that describes the qualities of a particular moment in time. And in particular, in the natal chart, we're looking at how we came into this world. So looking back, from tracking lunar phases to biological cycles to building shelters that would minimize or maximize exposure to the sun, observation of planetary movements was applied to everything that was important to us. And we developed these different branches or applications of astrology. Basically, all the ways that we engage in the world. Health and disease have always been a major concern for people. And so naturally, we would use astrology for that as well. The way that it was developed so bodily correspondences were made to the 12 signs, and planets were considered to be activating energies, describing different types of symptomatology and pathology. And so a good example of something that they would have understood to be related is venereal diseases. So these are diseases that are associated with Venus, the goddess of love. So sexually transmitted diseases would have had the indication of Venus. And so there comes the name, the venereal diseases. And so medical astrology continues this system of observation and correspondences, but focuses it on the human body. And so from there, we can look at something like constitutional medicine, herbalism, and cell salts. And ultimately, it's a nice system, right? It's pretty to look at, really great art. These approaches could give us a hint, but they're limited and they're not really individualized. And this is the kind of thing that we want to wrap our minds around, because even though they're more individualized than like a Tylenol approach, there's still protocols based on a bias, meaning that when we use a system like that to prescribe something, we're not prescribing it based on the thing that the person is expressing. And so I need to look back to say, okay, what did Hahnemann say? Because he did have a lot to say about this. He was an Aries, by the way, Aries sun, impetuous, trailblazer, no holds barred. He was courageous. He was a real pioneer. And he did let us know. So while translating medical texts from Greek and Latin, he developed into a system of medicine throughout his lifetime, what we understand as homeopathy. There are also different ways of practicing and applying homeopathy, acute, constitutional, whole person. And it's also a system of observation of something that's evolving and moving and changing and not fixed in time, which I really like as a parallel to astrology, because that's what's happening, The MICH method follows Hahnemann's instructions as closely as possible. And case-taking inquiry is essential for accessing the deeper dimensions to uncover the inner dynamic movement of the client in this moment. And so as I was building this presentation, it really, the penny dropped for me in so many ways, and especially aphorisms 9 and 10. So I brought in some aphorisms to really pull out what we're doing when we're using astrology and homeopathy to perceive what is unique in someone, and especially how it relates to the sun and the moon. So a famous aphorism 3, which tells us, to be a genuine practitioner of the medical art, a physician must clearly recognize what is to be cured in diseases. And so, we need to know what is to be cured in terms of what is this person suffering from, right? And clearly realize what's curative in medicines. So that is in each particular medicine to have the knowledge of medicinal powers. And we have to individualize what's curative in a medicine according to what someone is suffering from. So how do we do this, right? How do we do the thing, that first point, which is to like clearly perceive what is to be cured? And he illustrates and tells us, the unprejudiced observer, so well aware of the futility of transcendental speculations, notices only the deviations from the former healthy state of the now diseased individual, which are felt by the patient himself, remarked by those around him, and observed by the physician. And so he's really laying out how important it is for us to listen to the client, how important it is for us to listen to the patient. And with astrology, we might, I don't know, we might miss the forest for the trees, So basically he's saying, check your bias at the door. And in terms of my experience as a practitioner, it does take up space in your organism that does prevent you from being present with the person, which is how you're going to understand what needs to be cured. So astrology can be used then to recognize our own patterns and to help us develop awareness of our bias. So when we recognize that we are imbued with a pattern, when we are experiencing something that is unfolding within us all the time, and that we see the world through those goggles, we can better identify when we're seeing the world through the goggles. Yeah. So about knowing what's curative in medicines, he illustrates and tells us in an essay that he published in 1796 that only drug provings can lead to reliable knowledge regarding the healing capability of remedies. And I'm bringing this in because when we look at medical astrology, we see that there are correspondences between certain minerals, plants, even animals to the planets. And so at a certain point, medicine was really reliant on this kind of theory and information. But he looks at this and he says, only drug provings can lead to reliable knowledge regarding the healing capability of remedies, which means that it's only through our own felt direct experience that we can really understand what's curative in something. And it's also the only way that we can access the different dimensions of a remedy. So the different dimensions of information that we could understand can only be understood through a drug proving. And so he he details this some more in aphorism 110 and says that, the pure peculiar powers of medicines for curative purposes are not to be discerned through a specious a priori sophistry, which I needed to get definitions for. So basically he's saying, don't use information that's superficially plausible, but actually wrong, which is reasoning or knowledge that can come from theoretical deduction rather than observation or experience. So again, he really emphasizes, drug provings will give us that direct experience of what is curative in a medicine. So back to the zodiac net, what is compatible then? Because basically what he's saying is you can't just make a superficial observation and then build a theory from it and then look at that as if it's going to give you the information that you need to understand something on the dimensions that you need to understand it. And so what is compatible between what we see in astrology and what Hahnemann said is the energy of the sun and the moon are the lights of life. And this symbolizes how we interpret and express the vital force. And they are very, the sun and the moon are different than the other planets in the sense that they're luminaries. So they're really, it's the generative light and it's the reflective light. And so it is how we are moved by the thing that gives us life. Every living organism on Earth is affected by light. If there's no light, then there's no life. And so it really points to how essential the sun and the moon are for us. So how can we perceive the expression of the vital force in our clients? We could start with a map. But if I'm standing at the base of the mountain and holding a map, I don't know how much sense it makes, you know? Again, being absorbed in that map means we'll be distracted from something more important, and our energy and organism is diverted from that living, breathing thing in front of us. Just these two aphorisms, which are my favorite, they really bring us into what is important to observe. So in aphorism 9, he says, you know, in the healthy human state, the spirit-like forces, autocracy that enliven the material organism as dynamis, govern without restriction, and keep all parts of the organism in an admirable, harmonious, vital operation. As regards both feelings and functions, so that our indwelling rational spirit can freely avail itself of this living, healthy instrument for the higher purposes of our existence. So I'm understanding from this that there's the material organism that is organized by something immaterial. And that the goal or the purpose of this is that we can use the material in order to move our experience through it. In aphorism 10, he says, the material organism thought of without life force is capable of no sensibility, no activity, no self-preservation. So I see no movement in this whatsoever. It's really a static, dead thing. You know, it derives all sensibility and produces life function solely by means of the immaterial Wesen, the life principle, the life force that enlivens the material organism in health and disease. So basically what he's saying is that, you know, it really is an immaterial thing that we're working with when we're looking at life and health and disease. We really don't want to miss out on the experience of hiking that mountain, you know? We wouldn't know what the air smelled like or how the lights flicker and move. We wouldn't be present to notice any of the creatures that live there or the relationship that they have with each other. And again, this is a very embodied experience. Just looking at the contrast between standing at the base of a mountain, looking at a map, my energy is all in my head. Whereas when I go and I hit the trail and I smell the leaves and the mud and I hear the birds, it engages my whole organism. And I think that's what we're here for, you know? So when we're present with another person, we can see and explore and experience with our whole organism and not just our heads, you know? So we want to practice perceiving the deeper dimensions, that immaterial energy and the unconscious pattern that drives our movement in the world. By becoming aware of how we've made that pattern personal, we can facilitate our relationship with the transpersonal. So the thing that's bigger than us, so something that's bigger than our little point of view. And you're doing this in every holistic integration exercise that you do, because it prepares you to work with the energetic dimensions of experience. So it's important to do them because it's inviting you to practice with your whole organism what those different experiences are. When we're looking at the expression of planets, they're going to be modified by the zodiac sign that they're in. And they each represent something different. So for example, Mercury represents commerce, trade, business, communication. We know when Mercury goes retrograde, you know, miscommunication happens, emails get sent too quickly, they don't get sent at all. But if we look at what those things all have in common, you know, commerce, trade, business, communication, it's, you know, Mercury is making connections, and it does this by transporting goods through rail or by truck. It makes connections through communication. If we look at Venus, you know, Venus representing relationship and desire shows us that there's an urge to relate there. There's a deeper dimension of Venus that is about the force of attraction and adhesion. So holding and attracting growth. So in particular, I want to look at the deeper dimensions of Mars and Saturn, because they are going to show us how, you know, both planets are tough and competitive, but for different reasons. And they'll show it in different ways, you know. So someone who has a strong Mars or Aries or first house energy, they're going to be pretty extroverted, you know, active, focused. They're going to be competitive, impatient, brave, rash. They're going to think of themselves. It's really like my point of view, how I see the world. Some symbols that are related to Mars are surgeons, metals, especially iron. Think of iron going into forging swords or gates, you know. Mars also is symbolized by metal workers, butchers, policemen, soldiers, men in general, but I think mainly younger men, the strong yang men. And it's about, so Mars is the planet that represents our ability to act based on our desires. So to remain who we are and maintain our nature against threats. It's one-pointed, it's direct and forceful. In the body, it rules muscles and movement and kinetic energy. And Mars ultimately is our ability to fight, to be here and take our place. It's the urge for survival, to exist and be first. So anybody with a strong Mars, Aries, or first house placement is going to have an important part of their pattern locked up in that theme, in that experience. And so it's so primal, right? This is the thing. If being born doesn't unleash everything we've got to survive, then like, when would we do that? You know, so Mars is tough because he needs to survive and he needs to challenge. Saturn, on the other hand, is tough for a different reason, or tough coming from a different experience. So someone with a strong Saturn, Capricorn, or 10th house will have the experience of being responsible, reserved, practical. The core energy of Saturn is restrictive, limiting, and firm. And in the world, we see this in our relationship to authority and the rules of society in the world. Some symbols related to Saturn are authority figures, teachers, especially the strict ones, father figures, and older men. Saturn's the planet that represents our laws, structures, responsibility, and authority figures. And Saturn makes things tangible. It creates a physical manifestation of ideas and concepts and sets up boundaries and structures. And in the body, it rules the aging process. So there really is something about coming out of the round shape into something that is more rigid and harder. Saturn's our ability to work, limit, and protect, but it also has a strong relationship to our spiritual growth. Really deep, deep symbolism with Saturn. And so behind everything that Saturn's doing, there's an urge for growth and to transcend their origins, to be the best, to be secure, to reach the top. And so growing up and becoming an adult means we can direct our own lives. And a successful Saturn happens when we are successful at creating those lives for ourselves. It's about taking the action of Mars and repeating it again and again that allows us to achieve our goals and get to where we want to go in life. And so Saturn is tough, different from Mars, where Mars is having this urge to survive and challenge. Saturn is tough because he has to develop self-reliance and self-discipline and responsibility. And it's interesting too, when we look at the body, you know, the things that Saturn rules in the body are the teeth, the skin, and the bones. You know, the bones are the internal structure that allow us to stand, versus Mars, which relates to, you know, the muscular system, which is a little bit more external, but that's the thing that moves us. So on a really deep, energetic, symbolic level, these planets are all pointing to something that moves us, you know. So going back to the natal chart, it's a unique, one of a kind thing. It's a symbolic moment. So it's a symbolic map of the moment of our birth. It's a picture of our place in time and space. It no longer exists through us, which, you know, that could be stressful, because it's never to be repeated. It only exists through us. This is our first breath that has woven into our bodies that life energy and that life force, and that carries us into this world. So our life force is animating a single moment in time, and that moment in time only existing through us, which to me is like, it's wild, because I take that moment in time in a chart and it's so static and fixed, but then I remember that it's in that person, and that person is acting it out, and that person is enlivening it. And that's amazing, but it's so stressful too, because there's this sense of like, what if I mess it up? What if I can't do it? What if others mess up our moment? It's the goggles, right? And so the natal chart gives us the pattern that the person is realizing and making manifest. And we'll see all the elements of the ego that go into attaining and perfecting and defending or sustaining that pattern. And so we're demonstrating preference and aversion to everything that we do according to our interpretation of what keeps that moment intact and alive. And so what you're learning at MICH is going to give you clear indicators of different aspects of that dynamic movement. And we're seeing that as susceptibility, conditions of existence, reactions, driving, delusions, everything that emerges during case taking. And so remembering that the chart is a wheel and that life is movement, some days we're the mover, but hopefully we can practice being moved as well. And this again brings us into this sense that, when the ego appropriates that planetary energy by trying to control life and its experiences, imaginary and sensory, it isolates itself from the cosmos, and it can only fight to sustain itself as a frozen moment. When we surrender to something bigger than us, it lets us participate in the bigger movement of life. And these are just images that I thought were really cool that illustrate to me something that's moving without, too much of our own desire or preference or aversion. And it's allowing itself to become part of that bigger thing. So we're looking at the sun and the moon as the luminaries and the vital energy that animates us. How they're expressed through sign and house placement will show important themes and modes of expression. The sun always relates to the striving and the ideal, and the moon comes back to safety, reactivity, and sensation. For the astro nerds, we also want to look at the placement of Mars and the ascendant in the first house, which shows us the action of the striving, how I get what I want and how I defend what I have. But we're only going to be looking at the sun and the moon today. So the sun is known to be the generative light. It's said to have ruled over life, breath, and its movement. Generative motion is also considered under rulership of the sun. It represents eternal truths that are not subject to the realm of opinion. So this is something that's really meta, It's idealization, the soul, our ideal, our divine purpose and being. It's the ideal that drives us and that perfect idea in our head. And the sun has always been the ruler over things like ideal forms, reputation, kings and rulers like dukes, barons, and earls, who were at one point thought to be incarnations of gods, but also lieutenants. And that's interesting too, because lieutenants directed soldiers. When we look at the moon, it's a reflective light. And so in the chart, the moon is taking in and disseminating the light of the sun and the ideal. It rules the body, the mother, so it gives us the idea of the container. Also fortunes and possessions, things that come and go. And it was also associated with fortune. So all of the constantly moving events and circumstances of life. So everything temporal and of the flesh. So whereas the sun is this ideal that never changes, that's immutable and immortal and just perfect. The moon, even through its phases of reflecting that light, in a way, is perfect in its perfection, but it's temporal. And so it's imperfect in the sense that it's not immortal, right? So it's like this movement of evolution and adaptation that the moon brings. She sends to us what she collects and gathers from all of the other planets. So it being the closest planet to Earth, it acts as a bit of a transmitter to pull in everything else that's going on in the rest of the solar system. So we're going to look in particular at Aurum as the remedy that's associated with the sun, but some other remedies with a strong relationship to the sun are Arnica, which has a Sun-Mars signature, and Lac Leo. Aurum is made from gold, and that's a metal described as the king of metals. It's highly valued. It's always been used in coins, crowns, jewels, medals, and other objects of value. The weight of gold is expressed in names like gold bars, bar meaning heavy. And so heavy is the head that holds the crown. In the periodic table, we're finding it in row 6. So there's this need for power to take responsibility and ability to withstand very high pressure. In column 11, we're wondering if the structure will stand by itself. Will it maintain itself in adverse circumstances? So we're not getting a laid back, chill kind of vibe, right? From the MICH Materia Medica, these are the CHC highlights. Strong relationship to the vascular system and the heart. It's worse for cold air, winter, better for summer, warmth, motion, walking slowly. The delusion here is that they've neglected their duty and that they're forsaken, but music ameliorates. And that's really interesting, right? Music representing this order of the cosmos, maybe. They can be melancholic, suicidal, ambitious, again, neglected duty. The miasm is syphilitic. And then the top 10 clinical applications. The feeling for him is that he has to hold on to being highly responsible in every circumstance. And there are heavy responsibilities that have to be maintained and preserved. Strong drive to maintain his career, to hold on to achievement and praise like a gold medalist. It's a prime remedy for the deepest depression, a deeply wounded heart, and one of the major suicide remedies. And so when we look at the striving and the ideal and the reputation and what needs to be upheld and the responsibility, it's like, yeah, I can really see the correlation to the sun. The sun is a constant source of light. It's reliable. The sun will always rise the next day. So wow, like really, what's striving in that, eh? Each thing should maintain its predetermined place in order to accomplish what must be accomplished according to the government of providence. Everyone being in his or her right place is a source of peace and order. He feels he must be everything. He puts himself at the custodian of others' hearts. Did he try to contain the heart of all instead of maintaining himself the heart of God? So just looking at what the sun is doing, if it was not for the sun, we wouldn't have any light on Earth. We wouldn't have any life on Earth. It would be really bleak and it would be really dark, right? So we're seeing the relationship between the suicidal, melancholic, gloomy depression. And, you know, what it's doing is it's holding everybody in its place. If the sun was not there, it would just be, there would be nothing to organize ourselves around. So going back to the idea of the striving and the ideal and the vital force organizing itself according to that ideal, when we appropriate what that ideal should be, there will be an impingement on how freely the vital force could move and be expressed. So I really enjoyed seeing the relationship between the sun and Aurum. And then when I got to the moon, it was even better. This really, really, I don't know, this really lit my fire. And I was so excited to see the connections here. So the remedy associated with the moon is Argentum Metallicum. We're looking at silver, which has the highest electrical and thermal conductivity of any metal. So remembering that, you know, the moon is the collector of the patterns that are coming in from the other planets, we know that there is some type of transmission, or there is some type of connection that is happening, or communication, you know. So the structure of silver has an inward nobility, and it's interesting too because we've always seen like gold as representing the royal king and silver representing the royal queen. So the structure of silver having this inward nobility that manifests in its pure ring. And I didn't understand that sentence at first when I read it in the Materia Medica, but then it went on to say that it's like, it's the tone, it's the perfect tone. So we use silver tuning forks. And so there is something about that inner nobility, or that inner character, that Argentum really wants to have as the thing that it's reflecting or showing. It's also used in reflecting and reproducing pictures and images. And it's used in mirror production. And so it's prized in that because it's of a passive character and it only reflects and passes on. So rather than copper reflection, you won't see anything of the silver coming through in that reflection. We find it in row 5, where the emphasis or the theme is creativity and performance. There's a need to explore the new and to be creative, to perform, to be appreciated and defend themselves. A need to process the information and come to a conclusion, to analyze, improvise, research, invent, to devise, strategize, plan, and solve. And it's also in column 11. Structure is standing, but not sure if it's going to maintain itself in adverse circumstances. So it's really interesting to look at the moon as a constant movement, because even in its lunar phases, it's never fixed. It's always in movement, but it's also always in reflection. And I'm going to say it's like, it's always in communication, or it's always in performance, really, at the end of the day, you know, whereas the sun kind of has an easier job because it's fixed. It's like, I'm just doing this thing, you know? So yeah, I thought that was a really interesting thing. So in the Materia Medica, again, the CHC highlights, it's an affinity to the nerves, cartilage, mucous membranes. Worse using voice, talking, singing, reading aloud, because again, I feel like there's just so much going on with the moon, and it's, yeah. The better with motion, coffee, wrapping up, open air, mental emotions, loss of control. So over intellectual, temper, or emotions, pace, appetite, voice, hands, or limbs. The miasm is Cancer. Also from the MICH Materia Medica, the heart represents the central wisdom of feeling. It's the symbolic source of spiritual illumination, intuition, and truth. It's the seat of the self. As seat of the wisdom of reason, the head should reflect the heart's wisdom. So Argentum Metallicum has the feeling that I'll be appreciated only if I perform. And in order to be appreciated and maintain this position of success, I must keep up this standard in every creative venture or performance. There's an anxiety about maintaining their position, as any bad performance will bring them down from their successful position. I think I'm going to see the moon differently when I see it up in the sky. Silver, like the moon, is a reflector, a channel, but not the source like the sun. The feeling that something is missing on the inside, that which is immanent, pervading, and sustaining, rather than that which is transient and merely reflective. Argentum pretends that the reflection is the source within, which he feels he attains through intellectual activity and contemplation. However, any encounter with the reality of the external environment, disturbances, motion, intrusions, shocks, perturbs his attempts to achieve inner calmness. By avoiding external inputs, his imagination soon becomes empty of new ideas. His intellect is only able to reiterate the past. Nothing new, new movement towards becoming, step by step, and therefore he finds his ability to pretend or perform diminished. And that's the whole presentation, guys. That was so